comment all the lines out. But I'm just going to click the button here. You can see that it added a single tick mark to every line of code, thus commenting out the work that we've just done. I'll leave it here for your reference. All right. Now I'm going to create a few empty lines here by just hitting enter on the keyboard a couple of times. And now let's create another example. Here what I'll do is we're going to go console.writeLine, open and closing double quotes, what is your name? ? On the next line, we'll go console.write. Notice I'm not going to use write line. We'll talk about the difference between the two here in a moment. Console.write. And then I'm going to use double quotes inside of that and say, type your first name, space inside of the double quote. The next line of code, I'm going to create a bucket, or rather a variable called lowercase my, capital F in first, capital N in name as string. Okay, so let's talk about what I did here. Instead of using just a single letter as my variable name, I'm able to use a very long variable name. Furthermore, I'm able to use lowercase letters and capitalized letters in order to kind of give me a visual cue of where one word ends and another word starts. All right, and this is called camel casing. We'll talk about it in just a moment. And instead of creating an integer value, this time I want to capture from the user their name. Their name's not going to be stored in a bucket that can hold integer values, right? We're going to need to store strings of characters so that it can store Bob, B-O-B, okay? So that's what my goal here is, to retrieve the name of the user into this variable called my first name. And the way that I'm going to do that is through the use of the read line. And so we're going to use the read line in a slightly different way than we had before. So my first name equals console.readLine, okay? I'll explain what that does in just a moment. Make some more room, and then we're going to go console.writeLine, open and close double quotes, type your last name, and here actually I don't want to do write line, I'm just going to do write. We'll go dim my capital L last, capital N name as string, my last name equals console.readLine, and then finally console.writeLine. And here, this is going to look crazy. I'm going to do hello, comma, I'm going to use an ampersand character, my first name, another ampersand, that's under the 7 key or over the 7 key on your keyboard. And now I'm going to use an opening and closing double quote, but I'm going to put a space in between the two of them, all right? And this is just going to provide some spacing between the first name and the last name, like so. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here at the very top of this and explain what this is going to do. First of all, what we're going to do is ask the person for the first name. When they type in their first name and hit the enter key on the keyboard, then we're going to retrieve that value and stick it into a variable called my first name. We'll do the same thing with last name by creating a different variable, reading off the value and putting it into the value of the variable. And then we're going to do console.writeLine, and we're going to concatenate or append together my first name, my last name, and this literal string, hello, comma, space, using this ampersand character, which is the string concatenation operator in Visual Basic. It just means that you'll just tie together all of these individual strings, and we're using spaces here, like in this case, and in this case right here, in order to give the correct spacing between the various words. All right, let's run the application and we'll go and walk through it and talk about what it does. All right, so here we go. What is your first name? Type your first name. Here, Bob. Enter. What's your last name? Tabor. enter. All right, now I unfortunately forgot something very important in my program. What did I forget? Whoops. I forgot the console.readline. All right. So we can run it real quick again. And I also want to put one space here between the colon and that closing double quote so that it keeps it consistent between the first name and the last name. Let's run it again. All right, and here we go. What's your first name? Bob. Type your last name, Tabor. Hello, Bob Tabor. Very cool. All right, so great. First of all, let's talk about naming conventions. And convention is basically something that most programmers do. And they do it because it's not only a best practice, but because all the other programmers are doing it too. Okay. And so it makes your code look consistent if you were to share your code with other people. So in this case, I named my variable my first name, with starting off with a lowercase m in my, then the capital F in first and capital N in name. And so this convention is called camel case. And you should get into practice of using camel case whenever you name your variables, because again, most programmers do this, especially for variables that are declared inside of a given subroutine, function, or method. And we'll talk about the scope of variables in another lesson, but basically any variable that is of a local scope inside of a method, you should create them using this style of convention. You can name them anything you want. You should use long names and resist the urge to do what some books and some authors and articles that you might read online do, which is to use a convention like str first name. All right. The reason people do this is to remind themselves that this is a string. If your methods or functions are so long that you can't remember or you can't see their declaration in one page of code, then your methods are trying to do too much. But that's a whole other topic. Typically, you don't need to use that. It just muddies up the readability of your code. All right. So, and furthermore, if you were to hover your mouse cursor over a given variable, you can see pretty easily what the data type of that given variable is. In this case, my last name is declared as a string, as you can see there off to the right-hand side of that little bubble window that popped up underneath my mouse cursor. Okay, so the next thing that might have caught your attention is that we used write line versus write here in lines 14 and 15. The only difference is that write line will create a brand new line for the entire statement, whereas write will echo the characters that you have as input parameters, but it won't move automatically to the very next line. It'll just stay on that line. So that's what allowed us to say, type your first name. And then as we began typing, it came off to the right side of the colon that we had added right here. Okay. So here we have requested now the actual name of the user. And this is where we're using the console.readline in a slightly different way. We're retrieving whatever the user typed on the keyboard. And when they hit the enter key on the keyboard, at that point, the readline method will have executed and take whatever values were typed in by the end user and then assign them to this variable. So we've seen console.readline used without retrieving values like so, but it has this second function where it will actually retrieve back the values if we're interested in those values that the end user types in, and we are in this case. So we do basically the same thing here, nothing all that different until we get to line number 24, where we start appending values together into our write line in order to display them nicely to the end user, to format that string nicely. Now, there's two things that I want to point out about variables and about Visual Basic in general. First of all, Visual Basic is case insensitive. Now, other programming languages like C# will allow you to create two different variables that have the same name but with different casing. So you could create, for example, my first name all lowercase, and then create a second variable called my first name all uppercase, and then create my first name with uppercase, lowercase, uppercase, lowercase, and those would be three different variables. Okay, you can't do that in Visual Basic, fortunately. It makes it easy to step on yourself and to make mistakes if you're not careful when doing that in C#. So you can't do that in Visual Basic. That means if I were to do this, my dim first name as string, you'll see that I get a red squiggly line, and it says the local variable my first name is already declared in the current code block. All right. Why? Well, even though the casing on the F and the N is different, it is essentially the same as this declaration here in line number 16. So that's the first thing about Visual Basic, is that it's case insensitive. Now, when you type, sometimes Visual Basic will try to capitalize words for you automatically. So I'm not going to use the shift key at all as I type this. So dim, and notice when I hit the space bar, it made it from a lowercase d to a capital D. My other value as, and I'm going to hit the space bar and it capitalized the word as, and I'll hit integer and I'll hit the space bar and it capitalized the I in integer. So Visual Studio will capitalize words for you, but essentially that's a function of Visual Studio, not a Visual Basic. Now, you'll also notice inherently that while it is case insensitive, you cannot declare the same variable twice. So that's the second thing that we noticed here a moment ago. And that's why this would not work. My first name as string will give us an error because we've already declared my first name here and case does not matter. So you cannot declare the same variable twice like you can in other programming languages. Okay. So now that we understand how to declare a variable, let's declare it and initialize its value in a single line of code. So here, I'm going to comment out this line of code right there. And I'm going to go to the next line. Dim my first name as string equals, double quotes, Bob. So when I use the term initialize, that means I'm going to set the value of a variable immediately at the point when I declare it. That's like creating the bucket and the value in the bucket all in one line of code. All right. So typically what you want to do is give your variables values as soon as possible. This puts your variable into what's known as a valid state, which will be an important idea as we learn about writing real applications as we get deeper into this series of lessons. But also experienced developers like to write less code, and they're always looking for a convenient way to reduce the number of keystrokes and just the sheer amount of code that they have to read through. And so, you know, something as simple as at some point it's going to become simple to create new variables and to initialize their value. Instead of doing that in 2 lines of code, it just makes sense to put them all in 1 line of code. So what I want to do is actually now, let's comment out this, because that doesn't really make a lot of sense in this application to go ahead and initialize the value the way that we did here. But what I will do here in this little block of code is to kind of do it all in one shot on these 2 lines. Lines 22 and 23, let's redo this like so. Dim my last name as string equals console.readline. All right. So now we're able to do both of these things, not only create a new variable, but also initialize its value to whatever the user types in on the read line. Okay. All right, so we talked about quite a bit in this lesson. We talked about what a variable is. We talked about declaring the variable, choosing the right data type based on the kind of data that we hope to store in memory. We talked about the difference between an integer and a string. So now we've got 2 data types to work with, right? Numeric values, especially ones that are between -2 billion and +2 billion that have no values after the decimal point, or a string of individual characters. We looked at using the equals sign as an assignment operator for assigning and retrieving values. We looked at the arithmetic operator I didn't really talk about it, but basically we were just going to use the plus sign in order to add values together, just like we would do in any math problem. And we also looked at the ampersand, which is the code, the string concatenation character in order to append two strings together. We looked at the difference between console.write and console.writeLine, and we talked about naming conventions in camel case, and we looked at some of the rules of Visual Basic regarding naming, how Visual Basic is case insensitive, but it also will not allow us to create two variables with essentially the same name, but just with different casing. Okay, so we've added quite a bit more information under our belt about Visual Basic syntax. Let's continue the ball. We've got it rolling now. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, things are going to get a little bit more interesting. Based on the user's input, we're going to write logic to execute either one block of code or a different block of code. All right, so when I use the term logic, I mean that we're going to make a decision to execute one block of code or another block of code based on some condition, like, for example, the user's input, or maybe the state of the computer, the system itself that we're working in, or some other data that we have available to us. We're going to decide what to do with that input, with that data, and then react accordingly. All right, so what we're going to do is create a new project. I'm going to call it Decisions. So again, Visual Basic Console Application. We're going to call this Decisions. And click OK. And I'm just going to start writing some code. So again, what you'll want to do is pause while I'm typing this and type it along with me, and then I'll explain what it does. Now, I'm willing to bet that you can figure out what this does even without my explanation, because at this point things are so easy. But let's go ahead and just write it together, and then we'll go on and talk about it. All right, so here we go. Alrighty, there we go. So I think probably most of this would make sense as you look at it on my screen. The one thing that might look new to you is the if statement that we have here in lines 10 and the end if in line 12. And notice that there's this level of indentation then creating essentially a code block in between the if and end if statements. All right. So we've set up this condition if the user value is equal to 1. So if the value that the user typed in when prompted is 1, then what we want to do is set this variable message equal to the string value you want a new car, and then print that out to screen. So let's go ahead and run the application and just make sure it runs in this very simple case, which I'm pretty sure it will. When I hit 1 on my keyboard and hit enter, hey, we want a new car. But what we have not accounted for are the other cases. So for example, 2, nothing happens. And the same would be true even if we typed in something like Bob and hit enter. Nothing happens. All right. So first of all, we want to talk about the evaluation operator. It is the equal sign, so it's playing double duty. We can use it as an assignment to set the value of message equal to the value of some string, like you want a new car. But when it's used in the context of an if statement, here we're going to do an evaluation. Is this true? Does user value equal the number 1 or the string value 1? All right. If it does, then execute the block of code that's defined between the if and the end if. If this is false, so when I typed the number 2 or when I typed in the word Bob, then that's false, and we do not execute the values inside of that code block. Okay, so that is what I meant by making decisions. We're building logic and executing that logic, and then based on the input of the user, we'll decide what to display or what code to execute in a more general sense, whether we execute this block of code inside of the if statement or not. All right. So again, in this case, this is using the equal sign as an assignment operator. This is the evaluation or the equality operator. Okay. So what happens then if we want to try different combinations? Well, I guess what we could do is then start a whole new if statement. So if user value equals 2, then we can set the message equal to you won a new boat, and I'm willing to bet that that would work, but there's a more simplified version of this. Let's go ahead and just delete that, because what we can do is inside that same if block, we can create additional checks called else if statements. All right, so if the user value equals 1 is not true, then we're not going to execute this block of code. But what we will do is then move down to the next check, and in this case, else if user value equals 2. All right, and if that's the case, then we'll set the message equal to you won a new boat. I could also do else if user value equals 3, message equals you won a new cat. All right, and then finally, what if none of these are true? What if none of them are true, and at this point then, if we run the application and I type in the word Bob, I get nothing. All right, well, there's one of two ways I can handle that. In this simple scenario, I could assign the value of string to initially to bad input, like so. So none of these conditions would register, and therefore it would just stay at its default value, bad input, and that would be printed to screen. So here, Bob, bad input. But what I'd really like to illustrate for our purposes here, just so you can see, the last part of an if, else if, end if statement is just the simple else statement. And in this case, we're saying if this is not true, and this is not true, and this is not true, then, all right, well, this is the catch-all. Otherwise, just do this. In this case, we'll just set the message equal to bad input. Please try again. All right, or something like you lose, or whatever the case might be. And so this time, whenever we run the application, we type in Bob and hit enter, bad input. All right, great. I want you to notice something, how I designed this code. I could have, in each of these cases, just done console.writeLine and then said you won a new car, like so. All right. I would have had to add the console.writeLine in each of these else if statements and in the else statement as well. However, what I chose to do instead was just to define a variable and have it store the message that I want displayed, and then just call the console.writeLine a single time here at the very bottom. All right, so that's just a way to simplify the code, to structure the code in a very logical, easy to maintain sort of way. If I wanted to change how this message is displayed, I might have to change it in several different places. So for example, I might want to change, let's do this, and say result, colon, space, and then display the message. I would have to make a change to every one of these code blocks if I had written the value out. But now I can just make a change in one place and just display then the message after it. So just be cognizant of the fact that you can simplify your code and you can expand its functionality while reducing the amount of maintenance that has to happen in order to add new functionality. So I feel like I've accomplished that in this case by just kind of using this message variable to store the actual message and then only using console.writeLine one time in my application. All right, so finally what I want to demonstrate to you is I'm going to comment all of this out. And in some cases, you don't need the if, else, end if. You can use something just called the conditional method. So there's a method called if with an I, two I's, IIF, and then an opening and closing curly braces. Now, in this first part, what we want to do is set the expression. So let me actually grab some code from earlier here, and we'll grab these first 3 lines of code, and I'm going to select them all and then use the button that's right next to the comment out the selected lines, and this is the uncomment the selected lines, and that will remove the little comments from each line of code. All right, so now we have the user value again, and here what I want to do is if IIF open and close parentheses user value equals the value of 1, then after that 1 I'm going to use a comma, and you can see I can add a true part and a false part. So here what I'll do is say the true part is car, but for everything else, if that's user value is not equal to 1, then I'll say you just want a free cat. All right. So let me do this. I'm going to go dim message as string equals empty string, and then message equals if the user value is 1, then I'll give them a car, but anything else they'll win a cat. And then we'll do console.writeLine the message, and then finally console.readLine to stop the execution. And now let's run the application. And I'm going to type in the number 1. Great. And then I'm going to type in the value Bob, and I want a cat. I guess I need to improve this just a little bit and do this. You won a, and there's the message. And I might even just add an ampersand, and then I'm going to put a period to make the end of the sentence like that. Okay? Oh, I have a better idea. Let's fix this. I don't like that. That's a lot of concatenation. There's an easier way to do this. And I'll explain this syntax a little bit later, but inside of that string, what I'm going to do is add replacement syntax. And there's some special features of replacement syntax that we're going to see in an upcoming lesson that will allow us to format what we put in here. Like if we have a date or a currency value, we can do some really neat things. But for right now, I'll just use U1 a curly brace 0 curly brace double quote, and then I'm going to use a comma after that and then put in the message like so. Okay. Now I need to explain these commas inside of the opening and closing parentheses. You see that we have this if conditional method here, and we used a bunch of commas. What those are, it allows us to separate the input parameters to each of those methods. So sometimes a method only will accept a single input parameter like console.writeLine. Now, console.writeLine can also accept 2 parameters or more. In this case, we're going to give it a string and then a value that could be used in replacement whenever it comes across a replacement code. Again, we'll talk about replacement codes at length a little bit later, but you can see here I'm passing in 2 parameters to the WriteLine method by using a comma in between them. Here we're using 3 input parameters by using 2 commas. Here we do the evaluation. Is this going to be true or false? If it is true, then we give it the true part. And then if it's false, we give it the false part. And whatever's returned back from this method, whether it's car or cat, it'll be assigned into our message variable, which will then be added to our U1A, and then we'll replace whatever that replacement code is, whatever it's either car